The ink was still wet on the contract when I handed my father the cashier's check. 27 years of saving, investing, and building my career in the city had led to this moment. The farmhouse where I'd grown up, along with the 40 acres of land surrounding it, was finally mine. "Are you sure about this, Michael?" my father asked, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the check. His eyes, once bright and sharp, now carried a weariness that seemed to have settled into his bones. "Over the past decade, I'm sure, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's time I came home." My mother stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd made thousands of meals, where I'd done my homework, at the scarred wooden table where our family had shared countless dinners. She was wiping her hands on her apron, a nervous habit she'd never been able to break. Her face was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension around her eyes, the way her lips pressed together as if holding back words that desperately wanted to escape. "The price is fair," I continued, looking between them. "Actually, it's more than fair. The property appraiser said it's worth at least 30% more than what I'm paying you." My father nodded slowly. "We're not concerned about the money, son. We just want you to be happy." There was something in his tone, a heaviness, a resignation, that I couldn't quite place. But I'd been living in Boston for nearly 15 years, climbing the corporate ladder at a financial consulting firm, and I'd learned to read people's intentions through their numbers, not their words. The transaction was clean, legal, fair. My parents needed the money for their retirement, and I needed to escape the suffocating existence I'd built for myself in the city. "I'll take good care of it," I promised. "I know how much this place means to you both." My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she turned away quickly, busying herself with something on the counter. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window caught the silver in her hair, making her look older than I'd ever noticed before. My father cleared his throat, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times when he was struggling with emotion, and tucked the check into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "We'll be moved out by the end of the month," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've already found a small apartment in town, closer to your sister." "There's no rush," I said, though part of me was eager to begin renovations, to start my new life away from boardrooms and traffic and the endless hollow pursuit of more. They'd already begun packing. I could see boxes stacked in the hallway, labeled in my mother's careful, precise handwriting: kitchen, books, photos. Each box represented a piece of their lives being dismantled, redistributed, compressed into a smaller space. 40 years of marriage, of raising children, of building a life together, all being reduced to cardboard containers that would fit in a 2-bedroom apartment. I stayed for dinner that night, my mother's pot roast, the same recipe she'd been making since I was a child. The meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. The potatoes were perfectly seasoned. The carrots still had just the right amount of bite. It was comfort food in its truest form, a taste of home that I'd missed more than I'd realized during my years in Boston. We ate mostly in silence, the clink of silverware against plates filling the spaces where conversation should have been. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in a way that felt both comforting and ominous. My father asked about my job, and I told him I'd resigned, that I'd be working remotely as a freelance consultant. My mother asked about the renovations I was planning, and I described my vision for the house: updated kitchen, converted barn into a workshop, maybe even a small greenhouse for growing vegetables year-round. They listened with the same careful attention they'd always given me, nodding in the right places, asking appropriate questions. But underneath it all, I could sense something else, a current of emotion I couldn't quite name. Sadness, maybe. Or was it fear? There was a weight in the air, something unspoken that pressed down on us all, making even simple conversation feel like wading through deep water. When I left that evening, my mother hugged me, tighter than usual, her thin arms wrapping around me with surprising strength. "We love you, Michael," she whispered against my shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. No matter what happens, remember that we love you. Remember that everything we've ever done has been because we loved you. I love you too, Mom, I said, confused by the intensity of her words, by the way she held on just a fraction of a second too long. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My parents stood on the porch of what was now my house, illuminated by the yellow glow of the porch light that had welcomed me home 1,000 times before. They were holding each other, my father's arm around my mother's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. And even from that distance, even in the gathering darkness, I could see that they were crying, both of them, standing there on the porch, holding each other and weeping. I told myself it was natural. They were leaving the home they'd built together, the place where they'd raised their children, where every room held a memory. Of course, they were emotional. It had nothing to do with me, with the transaction we'd just completed. But something nagged at me, a whisper in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite silence, the way my mother had looked at me during dinner, as if memorizing my face, the tremor in my father's hands when he'd held the check, the boxes already packed, as if they couldn't wait to leave. Something wasn't right. I pushed the thought away and focused on the road ahead, on the excitement of my new beginning. I was coming home. Everything would be fine. Everything would be fine. 3 weeks later, I pulled up to the house with a moving truck full of my belongings from Boston. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The maple trees that lined the driveway blazed with color, deep reds and brilliant oranges that seemed almost unreal after years of looking at concrete and steel. My parents were already gone. They'd left 2 days earlier, taking the last of their boxes to the apartment in town. They'd called to say goodbye, to wish me luck with the move. My mother's voice had sounded strange on the phone, hollow, distant, as though she was speaking from the bottom of a well or through layers of thick glass. The house felt different without them in it. Empty, yes, but also somehow lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The walls bore the ghostly rectangles where pictures had hung for decades. The spaces where furniture had stood were marked by cleaner patches on the worn rugs. It was like looking at the skeleton of a life, all the flesh and warmth stripped away to reveal the bare bones beneath. I started unpacking methodically, room by room. I'd already decided to convert my old bedroom into a home office, and I spent the first day setting up my desk, my computer, establishing the infrastructure I'd need to work remotely. The physical labor felt good after years of sitting in ergonomic chairs, staring at spreadsheets. My muscles ached in a satisfying way, reminding me that I had a body, that I was more than just a brain processing data. By the second day, I'd made significant progress. The main living areas were functional, if not fully decorated. I'd set up my computer in the office and established an internet connection. I'd even started making a list of renovation priorities. New appliances in the kitchen, updated electrical in the barn, fresh paint throughout the house. That's when I discovered the locked room. It was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway I'd walked down thousands of times throughout my childhood and adolescence. A narrow door, painted the same cream color as the walls, with an old brass knob that wouldn't turn no matter how hard I twisted it. I'd never paid much attention to it growing up. My parents had told me it was just storage space, full of old furniture and boxes of things they didn't use anymore. Nothing interesting, nothing worth exploring. But now, as the owner of the house, as someone who needed to know every inch of the property for insurance and renovation purposes, I found myself curious. What was in there, and why was it locked? I searched for keys, going through every drawer in the kitchen, checking the hooks by the back door where my parents had always kept spare keys for the sheds and outbuildings. I found keys to the barn, to the old tool shed, to the cellar door that always stuck in humid weather, but nothing that fit the lock on that upstairs door. The more I searched, the more the locked room occupied my thoughts. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere in the picture I had of my childhood home. Why would my parents lock a simple storage room? What could possibly be in there that required a locked door? Finally, after exhausting all the obvious places, I called my father. "Hey, Dad, quick question. Do you know where the key is for that storage room upstairs? The one at the end of the hall?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, heavy pause that stretched out until it became uncomfortable, until I found myself holding my breath, waiting for his response. "Michael," my father said carefully, each word chosen with deliberate precision, "maybe it's best if you just leave that room alone." "Leave it alone?" I felt a flash of irritation. "Dad, it's my house now. I need to know what's in every room so I can plan renovations properly. The insurance company needs a full inventory." "Please, son," my father interrupted, and his voice cracked slightly. In the background, I could hear my mother's voice, urgent and worried, though I couldn't make out her words. Just leave it locked. For now. There are some things—" He stopped, seemed to wrestle with something internal. "There are some things that are better left undisturbed." I felt my irritation growing. "Dad, with all due respect, we had a legal transaction. This is my property now. I have a right to access every part of it." "I know," he said quietly, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. "I know you do, but I'm asking you as your father to respect our wishes on this. Please, Michael, please just leave it alone." The pleading in his tone caught me off guard. My father wasn't a man who begged. He wasn't a man who asked for favors or made emotional appeals. He was practical, straightforward, matter-of-fact, but now he was asking, no, begging me to leave a simple storage room alone. "Why?" I asked. "What's in there that you don't want me to see?" Another long pause. "I can't explain over the phone," he said finally. "Just trust me on this, please." We ended the call awkwardly, both of us uncomfortable with the tension that had never existed between us before. I stared at the locked door, feeling a mixture of frustration and curiosity that I couldn't shake. What were they hiding, and why did it matter so much? That night I lay in bed in my old room, now my office, listening to the house settle around me. The creaks and groans were familiar, comforting even. But my mind kept returning to that locked room, to the fear I'd heard in my father's voice, to my mother's urgent whispers in the background. What was behind that door? A week passed, then two. I told myself I would respect their wishes, that I would focus on other projects. I fixed the fence around the pasture. I cleaned out the barn, discovering old tools and equipment that had been forgotten for years. I set up my home office properly and started taking on consulting projects. But the locked room haunted me. Every time I passed it, I felt a pull, a magnetic draw toward the mystery behind that cream-colored door. I found myself standing in front of it at odd hours, my hand on the brass knob, wondering what secrets lay beyond. On a grey Tuesday afternoon, while I was reorganizing the basement, searching for the circuit breaker panel, I found it. An old coffee can tucked behind the water heater, covered in dust and spiderwebs. Inside were keys, dozens of them, rusty and forgotten, each one labeled with bits of masking tape that had yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I sorted through them. Most were clearly for outdoors, shed keys, gate keys, keys that no longer matched any lock we owned. But then I found it, a small brass key with a white tag that read simply, "Upstairs." I held it for a long moment, weighing it in my palm, feeling the cold metal against my skin. I could call my father again, tell him I'd found the key, ask for permission one more time. I could respect the boundary they'd tried to establish, honor their request even though I didn't understand it. But I was 37 years old. This was my house, my property, my right. And I was tired of secrets, tired of not understanding, tired of the feeling that there was something fundamental about my family that I didn't know. I climbed the stairs slowly, the key burning a hole in my pocket. When I reached the door, I paused, my hand on the brass knob. This was the point of no return. Whatever was behind this door, whatever my parents had been hiding, I was about to uncover it. part of me wondered if I should wait, if I should think about this more carefully, if I should consider the consequences of violating their trust. But a larger part of me needed to understand, needed to see what lay beyond this locked door that had occupied so much space in my mind. I inserted the key. It turned smoothly, the lock clicking open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. The mechanism was well-oiled, as if someone had been maintaining it, checking on it regularly. The door swung inward on hinges that didn't creak, didn't protest. Someone had taken care of this door, had made sure it would open smoothly whenever it was. Finally opened. The room beyond was dark, the curtains drawn against the afternoon light. I fumbled for a light switch and found one just inside the doorframe. When I flipped it, warm yellow light flooded the space, and my world shifted on its axis. It wasn't a storage room. It was a bedroom, a child's bedroom, pink walls, carefully painted and maintained. A small bed with a white frame, neatly made with a faded quilt decorated with butterflies. A dresser with a lamp shaped like a carousel, the kind that projected dancing horses onto the ceiling when you turned it on. Bookshelves lined with children's books, worn copies of Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are and Charlotte's Web. Stuffed animals arranged carefully on the bed and shelves, bears and rabbits and a giraffe with one ear missing. A rocking chair in the corner, its cushion still bearing the slight depression where someone had sat. A music box on the windowsill, its lid closed but dust-free, as if someone had handled it recently. Everything was immaculate, preserved, frozen in time. Not dusty or neglected, but carefully maintained, lovingly tended. This wasn't a room that had been sealed off and forgotten. This was a shrine. On the dresser sat a framed photograph, and my hands were shaking as I picked it up. It showed my parents, but younger than I'd ever seen them. My mother couldn't have been more than 25, her dark hair long and loose around her shoulders, her face unlined and radiant. My father stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face split by a grin so wide and genuine it made my chest ache. And in my mother's arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, was a baby, a tiny infant with a tuft of dark hair, and my mother's eyes. I turned the frame over with trembling fingers. On the back, in my mother's careful handwriting, were words that made the room spin around me. Sarah, our first, our angel, born March 15th, 1975. Sarah. I had a sister. The room began to spin. My legs gave out, and I sat down hard on the floor, the photograph still clutched in my hands. I had a sister. My parents had another child, a daughter, before me, and they had never, not once in 37 years, mentioned her existence. I looked around the room with new eyes, taking in every detail with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. The books were from the late 1970s. The stuffed animals were vintage styles. Everything in this room was at least 40 years old, preserved exactly as it had been left. On the small desk in the corner, I found more photographs in an album with a cloth cover. I opened it with trembling fingers, my breath coming in short gasps as I turned the pages. Pictures of a little girl with dark curls and my mother's expressive eyes. Sarah as a newborn, tiny and red-faced, wrapped in that same pink blanket. Sarah taking her first steps, her chubby hands reaching toward my father's outstretched arms. Sarah blowing out candles on a birthday cake. The number 3 spelled out in pink icing, her face illuminated by the glow of the candles. Sarah on a swing at the park, her mouth open in delighted laughter, her hair flying behind her. Sarah in my father's arms, both of them grinning at whoever was behind the camera, probably my mother, caught in a moment of pure joy. The progression of photos showed a beautiful, vibrant child growing and developing. But as I turned the pages, I noticed Sarah starting to look different, paler, thinner. In some photos, she wore a hat or a scarf covering her head. The last photo stopped my heart. It showed Sarah in a hospital bed, pale and thin, with tubes and wires attached to her small body. Her dark curls were gone. She was completely bald, but she was smiling, a weak, tired smile that broke something inside me. My mother sat beside her, holding her hand, trying to smile for the camera but failing completely. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her face haggard with exhaustion and grief. I turned the page, but there were no more photographs. Just empty black pages, waiting for memories that would never be recorded. In the desk drawer, I found papers, medical records. Words swam before my eyes as tears blurred my vision. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, aggressive treatment plan, poor prognosis, palliative care, and then at the bottom of the stack, a death certificate dated October 15th, 1979, Sarah Elizabeth Harrison, age 4 years, 7 months, 3 days, cause of death, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. I sat in that room for hours as the daylight faded outside and shadows crept across the pink walls. I cried for the sister I'd never known, for the childhood memories we'd never made. I cried for my parents and the unimaginable pain of losing a child, of watching their 4-year-old daughter slowly die despite every treatment, every prayer, every desperate hope. I cried for the decades they'd spent trapped in this house with their unprocessed pain, with this room sealed off like a tomb, preserving the memory of what they'd lost. How could they have kept this secret? Why had they never told us? And then slowly, horribly, I began to understand. They'd sold me the house that contained this room, this memorial to their first child, because they needed to escape it. They couldn't bear to live here anymore, surrounded by the ghost of what they'd lost, passing this locked door every day, knowing what lay behind it. But they couldn't sell it to a stranger who might dismantle this sacred space, throw away these precious artifacts, paint over these carefully maintained pink walls, destroy the shrine they'd built to their daughter's memory. So they'd sold it to me, their son, someone they trusted, someone who, what? Would preserve the memory? Or someone they hoped might finally, after all these years, help them let go? I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called my father. He answered on the first ring, as though he'd been sitting beside the phone waiting for this inevitable call. "You found it," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, tinged with resignation and something that might have been relief. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice came out rougher than I'd intended, thick with emotion and tears. "Why didn't you ever tell me I had a sister?" I heard him take a shaky breath, heard him struggling to compose himself. "Can we come over? Your mother and I. We need to explain. We owe you that much. We owe you the truth." "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but please, I need to understand." "We'll be there in an hour," he said, and I could hear the tears in his voice now. The dam finally breaking after 4.5 decades of holding everything back. An hour later, my parents stood in the doorway of Sarah's room, holding each other as if they might collapse without that mutual support, tears streaming down both their faces. And finally, after 45 years of silence, after decades of locked doors and hidden grief, they began to tell me the truth. We sat in the living room, my parents on the old couch they'd left for me in the armchair that had been my father's favorite spot for as long as I could remember. Between us lay 45 years of silence, of carefully constructed walls, of a secret so profound it had shaped every aspect of our family, without any of us even knowing it. My mother spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands twisting a tissue into shreds. Her name was Sarah. She was born on March 15th, 1975, 3 years after we got married. She was perfect, Michael, just absolutely perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a head full of dark hair. She came into the world screaming, so full of life and energy. The nurses said they'd never seen a newborn with such strong lungs. She had your mother's eyes, my father added, his voice rough with emotion. These bright, expressive eyes that seemed to take in everything, and her laugh, God, her laugh could light up a room. It was this pure, joyful sound that made everyone around her smile. They told me about Sarah's first years, the overwhelming joy of new parenthood, the sleepless nights and exhausted days that somehow felt like the most meaningful time of their lives. The milestones they'd celebrated, her first smile, her first word. It was Dada, my father said with a sad smile. Her first steps, her first day of preschool. She loved to sing, my mother continued, her voice growing stronger as she lost herself. In the memories, she'd make up songs about everything, about her breakfast, about the cat, about the flowers in the garden. None of them made any sense, but she'd sing them with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that her nonsense songs were masterpieces. She was fascinated by butterflies, my father said. We had this garden out back, you remember it, before we let it go wild, and Sarah would spend hours watching the butterflies. She'd follow them around, trying to understand where they were going, what they were doing. She said she wanted to be a butterfly when she grew up, so she could fly anywhere she wanted. She was so curious about everything, my mother added, and I could see the pain and love warring in her expression, always asking questions. Why's the sky blue? Where do dreams come from? What happens when we die? She'd asked that last one even before she got sick, and I never knew how to answer her. The happiness in their voices faded as they reached the next part of the story. She started getting sick when she was 3.5, my mother said, her voice dropping again. Just little things at first. She was tired all the time, which we thought was normal for an active toddler. She had bruises that wouldn't heal, but she was always running around, bumping into things. We thought maybe she was anemic, or that she wasn't sleeping well. We made an appointment with the pediatrician, thinking we'd get some vitamins, maybe some advice on her diet. She paused, her breath catching. My father took over. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in September, he said, and I could tell from his voice that he remembered every detail of that day, that it was burned into his memory with perfect, terrible clarity. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctor said it was aggressive, that we needed to start treatment immediately, that the next few months would be the fight of our lives. They started chemotherapy right away, my mother continued. Sarah was so brave, Michael, so unbelievably brave. She'd be throwing up from the treatments, losing her beautiful hair, covered in bruises from the needles, and she'd still try to smile for us. She'd tell us not to be sad, that the doctors were going to make her better, that she'd be home soon to play with her butterflies again. We tried everything, my father said, his voice breaking. Every treatment, every experimental protocol. We spent everything we had, our savings, our retirement fund. We took out loans against the house. We would have sold everything, given up anything, if it meant saving her. We prayed, we begged, we made deals with God, promising anything if he'd just let our little girl live. But nothing worked, I said softly, already knowing how this story ended, but needing them to say it. My mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. The cancer was too aggressive. It had spread too far. By the spring of 1979, the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. They offered us palliative care, a chance to make her as comfortable as possible for whatever time she had left. She died on October 15th, 1979, my father said, his voice barely audible. She was 4 years, 7 months and 3 days old. We were both holding her when she went. She just slipped away. One moment she was there, struggling to breathe, fighting so hard, and the next moment she was just gone. Peaceful, at least. She wasn't in pain at the end. The hospice nurse said it was one of the most peaceful deaths she'd ever witnessed. The silence that followed was heavy with decades of grief, of pain that had never fully healed because it had never been properly acknowledged, never been processed, never been shared. Why didn't you tell me? I asked finally, my voice rough with emotion. Why keep her a secret all these years? Why lock away her memory like that? My mother looked at me with eyes full of pain and regret. Because we couldn't bear to talk about it. Michael, after Sarah died, we were broken, both of us, completely shattered. Your father couldn't work for months. He'd just sit in that room upstairs, holding her stuffed rabbit, crying for hours. I couldn't function, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even look at other children without falling apart. We were drowning in medical debt and grief, and we couldn't face it. Your grandparents were worried about us, my father said. They thought we were going to die too, just from the grief. They suggested we try again, that having another child might help us heal, give us something to live for. We were resistant at first. It felt like a betrayal of Sarah, like we'd be trying to replace her. But eventually, we decided to try. You were born almost 3 years after Sarah died, in July of 1982. We made a decision before you were born, my mother said, her voice trembling. We decided we wouldn't tell you about Sarah. We told ourselves it was to protect you, that it wouldn't be fair to burden you with our grief, that you deserved to grow up without the shadow of a dead sister hanging over you. But really, she paused, struggling to continue. Really, we were just cowards. We couldn't face the pain of talking about her, of keeping her memory alive out loud. It was easier to lock her away, to pretend she'd never existed, to try to move forward as if we hadn't lost our first child. We sealed off her room, my father added, his voice thick with shame. We kept everything exactly as it was the day she died. We locked the door, and we tried to move forward with our lives. When your sister Emma came along 5 years later, we made the same decision. Not to tell her either. And then it became this terrible secret we were keeping, this lie we were living every single day. I thought about Emma, now 32 and living in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids. Does Emma know? They both shook their heads, looking at each other with expressions of shared guilt. No one knows, my mother said. We never told anyone. Friends and family knew about Sarah when she was alive, of course. They came to her funeral, but after she died, we just stopped talking about her. We'd change the subject if anyone mentioned her. We'd leave the room if someone tried to share a memory. Eventually, people stopped asking. They understood that we didn't want to discuss our first child, and when we had you and Emma, everyone seemed to accept that we'd moved on, that we'd put that chapter of our lives behind us. But we hadn't moved on, my father said, his voice breaking. We just buried it all deeper and deeper. We kept her locked away. In that room, yes, but also in our hearts. We never healed from losing her because we never allowed ourselves to grieve properly. We just buried it all and pretended it hadn't happened, even though it was eating away at us every single day. But it did eat away at us, my mother said, tears flowing freely now. Every day, knowing she was up there in that room, frozen in time like some kind of mausoleum. It was like keeping her in a tomb. We couldn't let her go, but we couldn't acknowledge her either. We were trapped between forgetting and remembering, unable to do either one properly. I began to understand the weight they'd been carrying, the impossible position they'd put themselves in for nearly half a century. Is that why you wanted to sell the house? My father nodded, wiping tears from his weathered cheeks. We're getting older, Michael. Your mother has been having health problems, nothing life-threatening, but enough to make us think seriously about our mortality, about the legacy we're leaving. And we realized we couldn't die with this secret intact. We couldn't leave this house to you and Emma without explanation, without you eventually finding that room and discovering the truth about your sister. But we were too afraid to just tell you, my mother admitted, her voice barely audible. We'd kept the secret for so long, 45 years, that it felt impossible to break it. The words just wouldn't come. We'd try to bring it up, to find a way to tell you, but we'd freeze every time. So when you mentioned wanting to leave Boston, wanting to come home and start over, we thought maybe this was the answer. We could sell you the house, and when you found the room, because we knew you would eventually, you'd force us to finally tell the truth. You manipulated me, I said, feeling a surge of anger cut through the grief and shock. You sold me this house, knowing full well that I'd eventually find her room, knowing it would tear open this whole painful secret. You used me as a tool to do what you were too afraid to do yourselves. You made me complicit in your deception without ever giving me a choice. Yes, my father said simply, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since they'd started this conversation. Yes, we did. And we're so sorry, son. We're so sorry. It was wrong. It was cowardly. It was unfair to you in every possible way, but we didn't know what else to do. We've been trapped in this for so long that we couldn't see any other way out." My mother was crying openly now, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "We know it was wrong, Michael. We know we should have told you years ago, decades ago. You had a right to know about your sister from the very beginning. Emma has a right to know. But we're weak. We've been weak for 45 years, and we're still weak now. We need your help. We need someone stronger than us to help us finally do what we should have done the day you were born." I wanted to stay angry. Part of me felt I had every right to be furious with them for their deception, for their manipulation, for the sister I'd never known, for the decades of lies. But looking at them sitting on that couch, holding each other like drowning people clinging to wreckage, their faces carved with decades of hidden grief and shame, I felt my anger dissolving into something else, pity, and a deep, aching sadness for all of us, for Sarah, who'd died so young, for my parents who'd carried this unbearable weight for so long, for Emma and me, who'd been deprived of knowing our own family history, for all the years of suffering that could have been avoided if they'd just been brave enough to speak the truth. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. "Why are you telling me this? Now, what happens next?" My parents looked at each other, and I could see some unspoken communication passing between them, the kind of wordless understanding that comes from 50 years of marriage. Then my mother turned to me, her eyes red and swollen, but filled with a desperate hope. "We want you to help us let her go," she said softly. "We want to have a proper funeral, a real memorial service where we can finally, publicly, acknowledge our daughter's life and death. We want to tell Emma and your cousins and everyone who loved Sarah. We want to stop hiding. We want to take down the walls we've built and finally let ourselves grieve properly. But we need your help to do it. We're too weak, too broken to do it alone after all these years. We're asking for forgiveness," my father added, his voice rough with emotion. "From you, and in a way, from Sarah herself. We failed her by locking her away, by making her memory something shameful and secret, instead of something to be honored and celebrated. We failed you by lying to you your entire life. We failed Emma the same way. We want to make it right, even though it's decades too late. We want to do better, to be better, even if it's at the very end of our lives." I sat there for a long moment, processing everything they'd told me, trying to absorb the magnitude of what they were asking. Part of me was still reeling from the revelation, still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that I'd had a sister, that there was this whole piece of my family history that had been hidden from me. But another part of me, the part that had studied psychology in college, the part that had spent years analyzing human behavior in corporate settings, the part that understood trauma and coping mechanisms, recognized something crucial. My parents weren't villains. They weren't evil people who deliberately set out to hurt anyone. They were just ordinary people who'd been crushed by an unbearable loss and had coped the only way they knew how in that moment. They'd made terrible decisions, yes. They'd caused harm through their silence and their secrets, but they'd done it out of pain and fear, not malice or cruelty. And now, finally, they were ready to heal. They were ready to face what they'd been running from for 45 years. They just needed help taking that first, terrifying step. "Okay," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Okay, I'll help you. We'll do this together. We'll tell Emma. We'll have the memorial. We'll finally give Sarah the acknowledgement she deserves. We'll do it right this time." My mother let out a sob of relief so profound it seemed to shake her entire body. She buried her face in my father's shoulder, her thin frame trembling with the force of her emotions. He reached out a hand to me, and I took it, feeling the tremor in his grip, the fragility of his aging bones, the decades of pain that had weakened him from the inside out. We sat like that for a long time, the three of us connected by blood and loss, and the tentative, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right, that maybe, even after 45 years of secrets and silence, healing was still possible. Outside, the sun had set completely, and the house was dark except for the lamp in the living room. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear an owl calling, and the wind rustling through the trees that surrounded the property. The same sounds I'd heard as a child, the same sounds that had lulled me to sleep 1,000 times, but everything was different now. I knew the truth, and there was no going back. Over the next few weeks, the truth came spilling out like water from a broken dam. Once the seal was broken, once the secret was finally spoken aloud, it seemed impossible to contain it any longer. First, we told Emma, I drove to Seattle with our parents, the three of us making the long journey in near silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what was about to happen. We arrived at Emma's house on a Saturday afternoon. She met us at the door with a bright smile that faded quickly when she saw our faces. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, her maternal instincts kicking in. "Is someone sick? Is someone dying?" "No one's dying," my mother said, though her voice trembled. "But we need to talk to you. There's something we should have told you a long time ago." We sat in Emma's living room while her husband took their 2 kids to the park. Giving us privacy for what he sensed would be a difficult conversation. And then, with me there for support, our parents explained about Sarah, about the secret they'd kept, about the locked room and the decades of silence. Emma's reaction was different from mine. Where I'd felt shock and confusion initially, she felt immediate, white-hot betrayal. "How could you?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face, her voice rising. "How could you keep this from us? I had a sister, and you never even told me she existed. You let me grow up thinking I was the youngest, thinking Michael was my only sibling, when all along there was someone else, someone who came before both of us." "Emma, please," my mother tried, but Emma cut her off. "No, don't, Emma, please me. This isn't some small thing you forgot to mention. This is a sister. This is part of who I am, part of my identity, part of my family history. And you just, what? Decided I didn't need to know? Decided it was easier to lie to me my entire life?" The conversation was painful, more painful even than my own discovery had been. Emma needed time to process not just the existence of Sarah, but the fact that she'd been lied to for 32 years. She needed to grieve not just for a sister she'd never known, but for the relationship she'd been denied, for all the years of not knowing, for the betrayal of trust between parents and child. It took days of difficult conversations, of tears and accusations and slow, painful reconciliation. Emma would call me late at night, still angry, still hurt, needing to talk through her feelings with someone who understood. She'd rage about the unfairness of it all, about how our parents had no right to keep this secret, about how she didn't know if she could ever truly forgive them. But eventually, slowly, she began to understand. She came to see what I'd seen, that our parents weren't villains, just damaged people who'd made terrible decisions out of pain. And she agreed finally to be part of the healing process. "I'm doing this for Sarah," she told me over the phone. "Not for them. I'm doing it because Sarah deserves to be remembered, to be acknowledged, to be part of our family story. She's my sister too, even though I never met her, and she deserves better than to be locked away and forgotten." Next came the extended family, my father's siblings, my mother's sister, cousins I'd grown up with. Many of them remembered Sarah, though they'd been young, when she died, and their memories were hazy, colored by the passage of decades. Others, like me and Emma, had never known she existed because they'd been born after her death, into families that had learned not to mention Sarah Harrison around our parents. The revelation sent shockwaves through the family. Phone lines lit up, family group chats exploded with messages. Some family members were angry that the secret had been kept for so long. Others were just sad, grieving anew for a little girl they'd known and loved, and then been forced to stop talking about. My Aunt Karen, my mother's younger sister, was perhaps the most affected. She came to visit me at the farmhouse one afternoon, and we sat on the porch drinking coffee while she shared memories I'd never heard. We used to talk about Sarah all the time right after she died, she told me, her eyes distant with memory. Your mother and I would cry together, share memories, look at pictures. We'd talk about what Sarah might have been, like if she'd lived, what she might have become. But then, after you were born, she just shut down. She wouldn't discuss Sarah anymore at all. I tried to bring her up once or twice. Remember when Sarah did this? Or, Sarah would have loved to meet Michael, but your mother would change the subject or leave the room. Eventually, I stopped trying. I thought maybe that was her way of coping, that maybe she needed to move forward without looking back. It was, I said, but it wasn't healthy. No, Karen agreed, shaking her head. It wasn't, but who can judge? None of us have lost a child. We don't know what we'd do in that situation. We don't know what kind of parents we'd become, what choices we'd make out of sheer desperation to survive the pain. The planning began for the memorial service. We decided to hold it at the small cemetery outside town where Sarah was buried. My parents had visited her grave regularly over the years, I learned, another secret they'd kept. They'd go early in the morning, before anyone else was around, and tend the small headstone that simply read, Sarah Elizabeth Harrison, 1975-1979, our butterfly. I never knew why you got up so early on Sunday mornings, I said to my father. I thought you were just an early riser, but you were visiting her grave. He nodded. Every Sunday for 45 years, I'd bring fresh flowers, clean the headstone, sit with her for a while. It was the only time I allowed myself to really think about her, to remember her, the only time I let myself feel the grief. The memorial would be more than just a service. It would be a celebration of Sarah's life, a chance for everyone who'd loved her to share their memories publicly instead of in whispered conversations or secret thoughts. It would be an opportunity for our family to finally acknowledge the loss we'd all carried in different ways, some knowingly, some unknowingly, for decades. My mother wanted to do something with Sarah's room. I can't keep it locked away anymore, she said one afternoon as we stood together in that pink room, surrounded by the artifacts of a childhood cut short. But I can't just throw everything away either. It feels wrong, like I'd be erasing her all over again. After much discussion, we came up with a plan that felt right. We would photograph everything in the room first, creating a comprehensive digital archive of Sarah's belongings and her space. We'd capture every detail, the books on the shelves, the stuffed animals on the bed, the way the afternoon light fell across the quilt, the view from the window where Sarah had once watched for butterflies. We'd preserve the room digitally so that it could never be truly lost. Then we would carefully pack away the most meaningful items, her favorite stuffed animals, her books, the photographs, personal items that held special significance. These would be distributed among the family, tangible connections to Sarah that could be kept and treasured. Last rest, the furniture, the curtains, the decorations, would be donated to charity, specifically to organizations that helped families dealing with childhood cancer. The furniture, we decided, would go to a hospice that created comfortable rooms for terminally ill children, places where kids like Sarah could spend their final days in peace and relative comfort. Sarah's bed, her dresser, her little desk, they would be used again by other children who needed comfort in their final days. She would have liked that, my mother said through her tears as we boxed up Sarah's books. Sarah was always worried about the other kids at the hospital. She'd share her toys with them, try to cheer them up even when she felt terrible. She had this enormous capacity for empathy, even at 4 years old. She'd want her things to help other children going through what she went through. The work of dismantling the room was agonizing. Each item we packed away felt like losing Sarah all over again, like we were conducting a second funeral, a second goodbye. My mother would pick up a stuffed animal and suddenly be transported back 45 years, remembering when my father had won it at the county fair, remembering how Sarah had named it and carried it everywhere for months. My father would page through a book and recall reading it to Sarah while she was in the hospital during those long nights when she couldn't sleep because of the pain or the fear. How she'd insist on finishing the story even though she was exhausted from treatment. I found myself grieving too, even though I'd never known Sarah. I grieved for the sister I'd never had, for the childhood memories we'd never made, for the conversations we'd never have. I grieved for the relationship that had been stolen from me before I was even born. I grieved for my parents and the decades they'd spent trapped in this house with their unprocessed pain. I grieved for Emma, who'd grown up as an only daughter when she should have known. She had an older sister who'd come before her, but alongside the grief, something else began to emerge, a sense of liberation. As we emptied Sarah's room, as we shared stories and cried together and held each other through the waves of emotion, I could see my parents changing before my eyes. The tight lines around my mother's mouth that had been there for as long as I could remember began to soften, to relax. My father's shoulders, which had been permanently hunched forward as though carrying an invisible burden, started to straighten. They looked younger somehow, lighter. They were letting go. Finally, after 45 years of holding on so tightly it had nearly destroyed them, they were letting go. "I feel like I can breathe again," my mother admitted one evening as we sat in the living room, exhausted from another day of sorting through Sarah's belongings. I didn't realize how much space the secret was taking up inside me. It was like carrying a stone in my chest all these years, this heavy weight that made every breath a struggle, and now I can finally breathe deeply again. "I'm glad we're doing this," my father said, reaching for her hand. "I'm glad Michael found the room. I'm glad we finally have to face it. I'm just sorry it took so long. Sorry we put you kids through this. Sorry we wasted so many years hiding from something we should have faced head-on from the beginning. We're here now," I said firmly. "That's what matters. We're facing it together now. And we're going to do right by Sarah, finally, after all these years." Emma flew back from Seattle for the memorial service, bringing her husband and their 2 children, a boy of 6 named Jake and a girl of 4 named Lily, the exact same age Sarah had been when she died. My mother wept when she saw them, overwhelmed by the bittersweet reminder of what might have been, of the granddaughter who would have been Sarah's same age if she'd lived. The night before the service, our entire immediate family gathered at the farmhouse, the house that was now mine, but that would always belong to all of us in some fundamental way. We sat together in Sarah's empty room, now stripped of furniture, but still painted that distinctive pink, still holding the echo of a little girl who'd loved butterflies and singing and asking impossible questions about the nature of the universe. "I want to tell you about your Aunt Sarah," my mother said to Jake and Lily, who sat on the floor looking up at her with wide, solemn eyes. "She was your daddy's sister and your Uncle Michael's sister, even though they never got to meet her. She was brave and funny, and she loved to sing. She had a beautiful voice, probably would have been a singer when she grew up if she'd had the chance. And even though she's not here anymore, she'll always be part of our family. Always." As my mother talked, sharing memories and showing photographs from the albums we'd carefully preserved, I watched my niece and nephew's faces. They were learning about loss, about grief, about the complicated ways families carry their history and their pain. But they were also learning something else, something perhaps more important, that it's never too late to tell the truth, that it's never too late to face pain, that it's never too late to choose healing over hiding. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and the house had grown quiet, I stood alone in Sarah's room one last time, before we painted over the pink walls. Tomorrow, after the service, I would transform this space into something new, maybe a guest room, maybe a library, maybe a meditation space. The shrine would be gone, but Sarah's memory would live on in a healthier way, in stories shared, in photographs displayed openly, in a family that was finally free to remember and grieve without shame. I thought about what I would say at the service tomorrow. How do you eulogize someone you never met? How do you grieve a sister you didn't know you had until a month ago? How do you honor a life that ended before yours began? But then I realized something important. This service wasn't really about Sarah, not anymore. Sarah was gone, had been gone for longer than I'd been alive, longer than Emma had been alive. The service was for the living, for my parents, who needed to finally lay down their impossible burden, for Emma and me, who needed to integrate this new understanding of our family history into our sense of who we were, for all of us, who had been shaped by this secret, whether we knew it or not. Sarah's death had created a wound in our family that had never healed because it had never been properly acknowledged or treated. Tomorrow we would finally clean out that wound, expose it to the light, and begin the long process of healing that should have started 45 years ago. It was decades overdue, but it was happening. And that, I thought as I turned off the light and closed the door one last time, was something worth celebrating. The morning of the memorial dawned clear and cold, with a November sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The cemetery was old, with weathered headstones dating back to the 1800s, their inscriptions worn smooth by time and weather, and the patient work of wind and rain. Sarah's grave was in the newer section, marked by a simple granite stone that had been polished smooth by my parents' hands over the decades of secret visits. We arrived early, just our immediate family, my parents, Emma and her family, me. The funeral director had set up white folding chairs in neat rows facing the grave. A small podium stood to one side. A local florist had delivered the arrangements my mother had special ordered. Butterflies made entirely from flowers in shades of pink and purple, hanging from shepherd's hooks arranged in a circle around the gravesite. They swayed gently in the morning breeze, their delicate wings catching the light. "It's perfect," my mother whispered, clutching my father's arm so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Sarah would have loved it. She would have wanted to touch each butterfly, to examine them up close, to ask 100 questions about how they were made. Gradually, others began to arrive. My Aunt Karen came with her husband and their 3 adult children. My father's 2 brothers arrived with their families, cousins I'd seen at holiday gatherings but never really known. All of them now adults with children of their own. Neighbors who remembered. When Sarah was alive, their faces lined with age, but their memories still sharp. Even a few of the nurses who had cared for Sarah during her illness, now elderly themselves, some using canes or walkers, but still carrying vivid memories of the brave little girl who'd faced her death with such grace. By the time the service began, there were more than 50 people gathered around Sarah's grave. 50 people whose lives had been touched, in one way or another, by a little girl who'd lived only 4 years. The service itself was simple but powerful. The pastor from my parents' church, who'd been a young assistant pastor when Sarah died and was now silver-haired and contemplative, spoke about loss and memory, about the importance of acknowledging our grief rather than burying it. "We live in a culture that tells us to move on," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery, "to get over it, to be strong, but sometimes the strongest thing we can do is admit we're broken. Sometimes. Courage looks like crying. Sometimes healing begins not with moving forward, but with standing still and facing what we've been running from." Then came the sharing of memories. One by one, people stood and spoke about Sarah, about who she'd been and what she'd meant to them. My Aunt Karen spoke first, her voice shaking with emotion as she described Sarah's infectious enthusiasm for life. "She had this way of making even ordinary moments feel magical," Karen said. "I remember taking her to the grocery store once, just a simple errand, and she treated it like an adventure. She wanted to know where every food item came from, how it grew, who picked it. By the time we left, she'd made friends with the checkout clerk, the bagger, and a woman in line who she'd decided needed cheering up. She was 4 years old and already understood something most of us spend our whole lives learning, that every moment matters, that every person deserves kindness." One of the nurses who'd cared for Sarah in the hospital stood next, leaning on her cane, but speaking with a steady voice. "I've been a pediatric nurse for 53 years now," she said. "I've cared for hundreds of sick children, but I still remember Sarah Harrison. She would draw pictures for the other kids on the ward, even when she was so weak she could barely hold a crayon. She'd ask us to read stories to the other children, even when she herself was in pain and needed comfort. She worried about everyone but herself. I've never met another child quite like her." My father spoke next, and watching him walk to the podium was like watching a man climb a mountain. Each step seemed to cost him something, but when he began to speak, his voice was stronger than I'd heard it in weeks. "Sarah was curious about everything," he said, looking out at the assembled faces. "She wanted to understand how things worked, why things were the way they were. She'd ask me questions I couldn't answer, big philosophical questions that most adults avoid thinking about. Where does the sun go at night? Why do people die? What happens to our thoughts when we sleep?" She was 4 years old, asking questions that philosophers have grappled with for millennia. His voice broke, and he paused to collect himself. "She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She loved animals with a passion I've rarely seen. We had a cat named Whiskers, and Sarah would spend hours just watching him, trying to understand how he thought, what he felt. She said when she grew up, she wanted to help all the animals that were sick, the way the doctors were trying to help her. She wanted to take away pain, to make things better. That was who she was, someone who wanted to heal, even when she herself was suffering." My mother could barely speak when her turn came, but she managed to share one memory, her voice so soft we all had to strain to hear. The night before she died, Sarah told us not to be sad. She was 4 years old, dying of cancer, and she was trying to comfort us. She said she'd seen angels in her room, and they were beautiful, and she wasn't afraid. She said they had wings like the butterflies she loved so much, and she was going to fly with them. She said we'd all be together again someday, and until then she wanted us to be happy. And then she fell asleep in my arms, and the next morning she couldn't continue, overcome by tears that had been held back for 45 years. Emma spoke next, and her words surprised me with their raw honesty. "I never knew Sarah," she began, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I was born 5 years after she died, but in a way, I've lived with her my whole life. I've felt the weight of her absence even though I didn't understand what I was feeling until a few weeks ago. I've watched my parents carry a sadness they couldn't explain, a distance they couldn't bridge. And now that I know about her, so much of my childhood makes sense. The way my mother would suddenly start crying for no apparent reason. The way my father would get this distant look in his eyes, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't see. They were remembering, they were grieving, and they felt they had to hide it from us." She turned to face our parents directly. "I wish you'd told us sooner. I wish I'd grown up knowing I had a sister, even if I never got to meet her. I wish Sarah had been part of our family conversations, our holiday traditions, our everyday lives. But I understand why you didn't tell us. I understand that you were drowning in grief and didn't know how to keep your heads above water. And I forgive you. I forgive you completely. And I promise," her voice broke with emotion, "I promise we'll never hide her again. Sarah will be part of our family story from now on, the way she should have been all along." Then it was my turn. I stood at the podium, my prepared remarks suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of all this raw emotion. But I began anyway. "I found out I had a sister exactly 4 weeks ago today," I said, looking out at the assembled faces, some familiar, some not, all brought together by the memory of a little girl who'd been gone for nearly half a century. "I bought my parents' house, intending to renovate it and start a new chapter of my life, and I found a locked room. Inside was a little girl's bedroom, perfectly preserved, frozen in time like a museum exhibit. Everything in that room spoke of love, the careful way it had been maintained, the treasured possessions kept safe and dust-free, the photographs displayed with such obvious care." I paused, gathering my thoughts. For 45 years, my parents kept Sarah locked in that room. They thought they were protecting Emma and me from pain. They thought they were moving forward with their lives, but really, they were frozen in time, just like that room. They couldn't grieve because they'd never allowed themselves to acknowledge the loss. They couldn't heal because they'd made their grief a forbidden subject, a secret too painful to share. I was angry when I first found out. I felt betrayed, manipulated, robbed of the chance to know my own sister. And those feelings were valid. They were real. But I've come to understand something important over these past few weeks. Pain doesn't go away just because we refuse to look at it. It just goes underground, where it spreads and infects everything it touches. My parents' unacknowledged grief affected every aspect of our family life, shaped every interaction, colored every moment, even though Emma and I didn't know it, even though we couldn't see the invisible wound that was always there. But here's the thing about truth, I continued, my voice growing stronger. It wants to be known. It pushes its way to the surface eventually, no matter how deeply we bury it. And when it does finally emerge, when we finally have the courage to face it head on, something miraculous can happen. We can heal. Not instantly, not easily, but truly. I never knew my sister Sarah. I never got to hear her laugh or watch her play or listen to her made-up songs about butterflies and breakfast cereal. I never got to answer her impossible questions or watch her grow up or see what kind of woman she might have become. But I know her now, through all of you, through your memories and your stories and the love that's so obvious in every word you've spoken today. And I know something else. She wouldn't want us to keep hurting. She wouldn't want her death to be a source of pain that we carry in secret shame. Sarah was brave enough to face her own death at 4 years old, brave enough to comfort her parents as she was dying. The least we can do is be brave enough to remember her honestly, to speak her name out loud, to let her be part of our family story the way she deserves. So today, we're not just remembering Sarah. We're freeing her. We're taking her out of that locked room and putting her where she belongs, in our family history, in our conversations, in our hearts. And in doing so, we're freeing ourselves too from the prison of secrets, from the burden of unspoken grief, from the exhausting work of pretending we're okay when we're not. I looked around at the faces before me, at the tears and the nods of understanding. If you take anything from today, let it be this. Don't hide your pain. Don't lock away your grief. Don't make your sorrow a secret that eats away at you from the inside. Face it, share it, let people help you carry it, because that's what family is for. That's what community is for. We're meant to bear each other's burdens, not suffer alone in the darkness. When I finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. My mother was openly sobbing, but they weren't tears of pure grief anymore. They were mixed with something else. Relief, release, maybe even a kind of joy that Sarah's memory could finally be honored publicly, that she could finally take her rightful place in our family story. We sang hymns that Sarah had loved. My Aunt Karen remembered them, simple children's songs about Jesus loving all the children and building houses on solid foundations. We released butterflies that the florist had special ordered, watching them flutter up into that impossibly blue November sky like tiny souls taking flight, like Sarah herself ascending to whatever peace she'd found beyond this life. We planted a dogwood tree next to Sarah's grave, a tree that would bloom pink every spring in her memory, a living memorial that would grow and change and adapt while the headstone remained forever static. And then, one by one, people came up to my parents. They hugged them, they held them, they told them they loved them. They said things like, "I'm so glad you finally told everyone," and "It's okay to grieve, you don't have to be strong anymore." And "Sarah was so lucky to have you as parents, even if it was only for 4 years." My mother, who had spent 45 years carrying her grief in silence, was suddenly surrounded by a circle of love and acceptance. My father, who had locked his pain away and tried to soldier on as if nothing had happened, was being given explicit permission to fall apart, and they did. They cried in a way I'd never seen them cry before, fully, openly, without shame or the need to hide or apologize for their tears. It was one of the most beautiful, heartbreaking, transformative things I'd ever witnessed. This was what healing looked like. This was what freedom looked like. This was what happened when you finally, after decades of hiding, stepped into the light and let yourself be seen in all your brokenness and pain. As the service ended and people began to drift away, offering final hugs and promises to stay in touch, I stood beside Sarah's grave and felt something shift inside me. I'd come to this town to escape my old life, to start over, to find peace. I'd had no idea that I was actually coming home, to uncover a family secret that would change everything. But standing there in that cemetery, surrounded by my family, with butterflies still fluttering overhead, and that dogwood tree standing as a living promise of springs to come, I understood that this was exactly where I needed to be. This was exactly what I needed to do. Sometimes we don't choose our purpose. Sometimes it chooses us. And mine, it seemed, was to help my family heal.